Welcome, class. Grab a seat. I'm so glad you're here today. We're about to dive into this really incredible journey that maps out, well, not just a literal physical road trip across the ancient world, but what it actually means to put our faith into action. You know, as an 8th grader, you are constantly soaking up new concepts. But today's lesson, it's all about how we take what we know in our heads and actually live it out in the real world. We're going to be looking at the Apostle Paul, his totally massive travel goals, and this really surprising detour he took that teaches us a pretty huge lesson about generosity.
Here is our quick game plan for today. We'll trace Paul's ultimate travel plans, check out his detour to Jerusalem, learn how the gospel is about words and actions, see how he was guided by God's purpose, and then wrap up with what this means for you as a godly learner.
Okay, before we get into the ancient maps, I want you to think about something for a second. Have you ever planned an absolutely epic, massive trip? Maybe it's your dream summer vacation or this awesome weekend away with your friends. But then you realize you have a really big responsibility you've got to take care of before you can actually go. Maybe it's a huge science project or, a week's worth of chores around the house. You've got all this excitement for the destination, but you are completely grounded by a vital job you just have to finish first before you can even pack your bags. Well, that is exactly the situation the Apostle Paul found himself in.
So let's start with part 1, Paul's ultimate travel plans.
If you open up to Romans chapter 15, specifically verses 22 through 29, Paul actually lays out his ultimate travel itinerary. Now, he'd already been incredibly busy preaching the gospel all over the place, but his eyes were set way out on the horizon. His plan was to go to Jerusalem, then he desperately wanted to visit the believers in Rome, and ultimately he wanted those Roman believers to help launch him all the way onward to Spain.
Now, why Spain? Right? Well, Paul's heart was completely laser-focused on one single mission, carrying the good news to more people in more nations. Back then, Spain was essentially the western edge of the known map. He wanted to push the boundaries. He wanted to take the gospel to completely unreached places where the name of Jesus had literally never been heard before.
So you might be wondering, okay, why did he need to stop and visit the believers in Rome on his way there? Well, he deeply desired to connect with that Roman church so they could support him and help him on his way further west. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed the fellowship, the encouragement, and frankly, the practical support of the Roman believers to kick off that massive next phase of his mission.
But this brings us to part 2, the Jerusalem detour. Remember that big responsibility we talked about?
This right here is our memory verse for the day. Romans 15:25 says, "But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints." It highlights this totally surprising U-turn. Paul takes his grand, exciting plans for Rome and Spain and he puts them completely on hold. Why? All so he can travel in the exact opposite direction to serve others.
Now, what exactly does it mean to minister to the saints here? Basically, it means he was playing delivery driver for a major financial contribution. Believers in Macedonia and Achaia, these are other regions where Paul had preached, had scraped together this incredibly loving, generous financial gift to help out the poor believers back in Jerusalem who were really struggling. Paul was taking this gift directly to them. He actually took this responsibility so seriously that he delayed his absolute dream trip just to make sure these people were cared for first.
And that leads us to our third point. The gospel is about words and actions. This detour Paul took reveals a really profound truth. True gospel ministry requires two different things working together. Yes, absolutely, it involves preaching with words, sharing the truth, teaching about Jesus, but equally as important, it has to include love, generosity, and real physical service. The gospel is never, ever just about speaking. It is fundamentally about actively caring for the real-life needs of God's people.
So let's make this personal. How can generosity and service be part of living out the gospel in your own everyday 8th grade life? When we look at Paul choosing to prioritize the poor in Jerusalem over his dream trip to Spain, we're looking at a guy who totally understood that actions speak way louder than words. Caring for someone's physical needs actually opens the door for them to hear the spiritual truth you want to share.
So I've got a challenge for you this week. You don't have to charter a boat across the Mediterranean to be like Paul. You can just pick one of these super practical ways to serve right here at school. Write an encouraging note to someone who seems a little down. Maybe help a classmate who's struggling with that massive history project. Share your school supplies. Or honestly, just commit to actively praying for a friend who's going through a tough time. That is exactly what gospel action looks like in the hallway.
Moving into part 4, guided by God's purpose.
Everything we just talked about, the bold preaching, the detour to deliver financial gifts, it was all anchored in something so much bigger than Paul's own ambitions. He believed his travels should be entirely guided by God's purpose.
He actually wrote that when he finally did make it to Rome, he wanted to arrive in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. In other words, he didn't want to show up on his own terms or on his own schedule. He wanted his entire journey to be completely saturated with God's perfect will.
And guys, this brilliantly illustrates what it actually looks like to live a life that pleases the Father. When we live with a surrendered faith, we're aligning our plans with God's plans. It means being willing to serve even when it is totally inconvenient. It means having a generous heart, being ready to go wherever God calls you, and constantly building up the people around you. It's basically handing God the GPS and saying, "All right, my map is yours to draw."
Finally, let's hit our last point, the godly learner. Let's bring all this history right to your desk.
This right here represents the very heartbeat of our philosophy at HeroesMart Academy. We deeply believe that education without biblical morality can actually cause a lot of harm. Think about it. If you just gain a ton of knowledge and intelligence, you simply become a more capable person. But without a moral compass, that capability can easily lead to really destructive decisions. That is exactly why we have to intertwine our education with biblical wisdom. True knowledge, when it's paired with that surrendered faith we talked about, equips you to make wise, God-honoring choices rather than just making you a smart person.
The Apostle Paul nails this in Romans chapter 8, verse 6. He says, "For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace." A carnal or worldly mind is actually opposed to God. But just like Paul centered his whole life on spiritual goals instead of just seeking worldly travel or personal glory, keeping your mind spiritually focused in your studies leads to genuine life and peace. Having intelligence alone isn't the finish line, guys. Having godly intelligence is.
So as a godly learner, this is your focus. We absolutely want you to passionately pursue academic excellence. Study hard, ace those tests, learn everything you possibly can. But as you do, you have to intertwine that education with biblical morality. Keep your mind entirely centered on God, on truth, and on wisdom. That way, every single bit of intelligence you gain is used to honor Him and serve others, just like Paul did. As we wrap up today's lesson and you start grabbing your backpacks, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. How will you use your growing intelligence to make God-honoring choices today? Seriously, don't just settle for being smart. Strive to be wise. Use what you're learning here to live out the gospel in action, to serve your classmates generously, and to faithfully follow the amazing map God has laid out for your life. Have an awesome rest of your day, class, and I will see you all next time.